All right, so you know how it is, right? We're always trying to keep up with what's going on, especially when we see those headlines that make us wonder if the rules are changing.
Absolutely. And it can get pretty confusing.
It really can. So that's what we're doing here today, trying to make sense of things.
Right.
And this time, we're diving deep into a YouTube video just for you.
Oh, which one?
This one is from the Ring of Fire channel.
Okay, yeah, I've seen some of their stuff.
And this one is titled, "Some of Trump's Day One Orders Are Unconstitutional, and He Doesn't Care."
Wow. Okay, so right off the bat, that title's pretty provocative.
It is. And the video itself is pretty intense. Like, it lays out some pretty serious accusations about stuff that supposedly happened really early on in an administration.
Interesting. I'm curious to hear what they're saying.
Well, the big takeaway is that they're arguing that many of these actions weren't just like, regular policy choices that someone might disagree with.
Right.
They're claiming that they were actually unconstitutional, like flat out against the law.
So suggesting a potential abuse of presidential power, then.
Exactly. That's what we're going to try to figure out in this deep dive. We're going to unpack those arguments, look at the legal side of things, and try to make sense of it all. What are they actually saying?
That's good.
So right from the start, the video jumps into this idea that there were just a ton of executive orders and actions that came out in the first day and a half.
Oh, wow. So a real flurry of activity.
Exactly. Like someone was really eager to get stuff done.
Right, which, on one hand, you can see the appeal of that. Like hitting the ground running, making changes fast.
Right, but that's where it starts to get tricky, right?
Yeah, when you're talking about making changes that fast, you have to wonder if it's possible to do everything by the book.
Totally. And that's a big part of what the video is highlighting, this tension between speed and legality.
Like, how do you balance getting things done quickly with making sure you're not overstepping your authority?
Exactly. And the next thing they bring up is what legal scholars are saying about all this.
Okay, and what's their take?
Well, according to the video, these experts, the folks who really understand the ins and outs of the law, they think that a lot of these actions were either unconstitutional or a clear overreach of power.
Oh, wow. So that's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. And it's coming from people who know their stuff, which makes it even more concerning.
Absolutely. Like, it's one thing if it's just one person's opinion, but when you've got multiple legal experts raising red flags, you have to pay attention.
For sure. It means it's not just about politics anymore. It's about potentially violating the very document that defines how the country runs.
Yeah, that's a whole different ballgame.
Exactly. And then the video gets even more specific. They start listing out some concrete examples of the actions they think were problematic.
Okay, so like what?
Well, the first one they bring up is the idea of ending birthright citizenship by executive order.
So essentially saying that anyone born in the U.S. is automatically a citizen.
Right. And the video is very clear that this just isn't something a president can do through an executive order. It would require a constitutional amendment.
Which is a much higher bar to clear.
Oh, yeah, way more complicated. It involves Congress and state legislatures. It's a whole process.
So basically, the video is arguing that this specific action goes against the 14th Amendment.
Right, which basically guarantees citizenship to anyone born in the U.S. And, the Supreme Court has consistently supported that interpretation.
Right, so there's a ton of legal precedent for that.
Exactly. So for someone to try to change that with just an executive order, well, that would be a huge deal.
It would be like saying they're above the Constitution, which is, not how things work.
Right. It would be a real challenge to the balance of power.
Okay, so what's the next example they bring up?
This one's a bit more obscure. It's about the Alien Enemies Act.
I'm not super familiar with that one.
Yeah, it's not something that comes up every day. Basically, it's a law that lets the government detain or remove non-citizens who are from a hostile country during wartime.
Okay, so during an active conflict.
Right, like a declared war or an actual invasion. That's a key point that the video really emphasizes. Because legal experts are saying that you can't just use that act whatever you want. It has to be tied to a specific situation, like an actual war that's been declared.
So the video is arguing that there wasn't such a situation here.
Right, and that makes using the Alien Enemies Act in this context legally questionable.
I see, so it's all about context. Like, the law itself might be fine, but it has to be applied correctly.
Exactly. It's not just a blank check. There are specific conditions that need to be met.
Okay, so that's two pretty big examples. What's the third one?
The third one they bring up is declaring a national emergency at the border.
Okay, we've definitely heard that phrase a lot in recent years.
We have, and the video is basically questioning whether there was actually a legitimate emergency situation that justified that declaration.
Because that triggers a whole set of special powers for the president.
Right, exactly. Like, when a national emergency is declared, it opens up a lot of possibilities for the executive branch to act quickly and with fewer restrictions.
But the video is suggesting that maybe it wasn't really an emergency in the legal sense of the word.
Right, like maybe the situation at the border, while definitely important and challenging, didn't actually meet the criteria for a national emergency as defined by the law.
So again, it comes down to whether the action was justified or if it was an overreach of power.
Totally. And it raises questions about how we define a national emergency. Like, what are the standards and who decides when they've been met?
Right, because that's a pretty powerful tool for a president to have. And it shouldn't be used lightly.
Definitely. Now, the video doesn't just stop at pointing out these potential legal problems. It goes even further.
In what way?
Well, it expresses a real lack of faith in the court system's ability to actually step in and overturn these actions.
Whoa, so even if these actions are found to be unconstitutional, the video is skeptical that anything will actually change.
Yeah, and that brings up some serious concerns about the checks and balances we rely on. Like, what's the point of having laws if they can be ignored without consequence?
Right, it undermines the whole idea of a system where no one is above the law.
Exactly. And the video points to a couple of reasons for this skepticism. One is the influence of presidential appointments on the judiciary.
Right, because the president appoints judges, including Supreme Court justices.
And the video specifically mentions the 3 Supreme Court justices appointed by this president and the possibility of more appointments in the future.
So the concern is that these judges might be more likely to side with the president's actions, even if there are strong legal arguments against them.
That's exactly it. And that raises questions about whether the courts can truly act as an independent check on executive power.
Yeah, I mean, ideally the judiciary should be impartial and not beholden to any one branch of government.
Exactly. But when you have so many judges appointed by the same president, it's natural to wonder if their decisions might be influenced by that.
It's a valid concern, for sure. And it goes beyond just this specific situation. It raises questions about the long-term implications for judicial independence.
Absolutely. Then the speaker in the video goes on to express their own personal lack of faith in the system.
Okay, so this is where we get into opinion territory.
Right. Like, they're definitely speaking from a place of frustration and distrust. They even bring up the individual's past, mentioning that they're a convicted felon as evidence that they might not respect legal boundaries.
So they're using that to support their argument that this person is likely to disregard the law.
Exactly. But it's important to separate personal opinions from legal analysis.
For sure. I mean, someone's past actions might be relevant in some contexts, but when we're talking about the legality of specific actions, we have to focus on the law itself.
Totally. Like, whether you personally trust someone or not shouldn't affect how you judge the constitutionality of their actions.
It's about separating the person from the office and evaluating the actions objectively.
Exactly. Now, here's another interesting point the video makes. They criticize the idea of just waiting for legal challenges to stop these actions.
They're saying it's not enough to just rely on the courts.
Right. They call it a false sense of security because they don't believe the legal process will be fast enough or effective enough to actually prevent these policies from being implemented.
So they're suggesting a sense of urgency, like something needs to be done now, not later.
Definitely. And it reflects a lack of faith in the traditional legal process as a reliable safeguard against executive overreach.
I mean, the legal system can be slow, that's for sure. And sometimes it can feel like justice delayed is justice denied.
Exactly. And the video seems to be arguing that, in this case, waiting for the courts to act might be too little, too late.
Which is a scary thought, because it implies that the system designed to protect our rights might not be up to the task.
It's a really thought-provoking point. Okay, so one last thing I want to touch on. The video actually acknowledges that the Supreme Court has upheld birthright citizenship multiple times in the past.
Okay, so they recognize that there's a strong legal precedent for that.
They do, but then they almost immediately turn around and question whether that precedent will hold up in the current environment.
Interesting. So they're basically saying that even though something has been decided by the Supreme Court before, it doesn't mean it's set in stone forever.
Right, and that's a really important point to understand about how our legal system works. Like, it's not just a set of fixed rules. There's a concept called stare decisis, which basically means courts should generally stick to previous rulings.
To provide consistency and predictability.
Exactly. But the thing is, even long-standing precedents can be revisited and overturned, especially if the composition of the court changes or if societal views evolve.
So essentially, the video is asking us to consider whether even seemingly settled legal principles are truly safe from change.
Exactly. And that brings us to the heart of the tension that this video is highlighting.
Which is?
Well, on one hand, you have these claims, supported by legal experts, that some of these early executive actions might be unconstitutional or a clear overreach of power.
And on the other hand, you have a deep skepticism about whether the systems we rely on to protect us from those kinds of actions, especially the courts, will actually be effective.
Exactly. And it all comes down to this fundamental question of who has the power to interpret and enforce the Constitution.
Right, because the video is clearly arguing that this particular administration might not feel bound by those limits.
Totally. And they use those specific examples we talked about to illustrate that point. Ending birthright citizenship by executive order, invoking the Alien Enemies Act without a declared war, and declaring a national emergency at the border without sufficient justification.
Right, those are all pretty concrete examples of how presidential power could potentially be used in ways that go against the Constitution.
Exactly. And it leaves us with a lot to think about. Like, if the systems we rely on to protect our rights aren't working, what does that mean for the future?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
And it's not one with an easy answer.
Definitely not. But it's one we need to be asking ourselves. So here's a final thought for you to consider. If we're seeing these concerns about the effectiveness of our legal and institutional checks and balances, what does that mean for our ability to uphold those constitutional principles in the long run? Like, how do we make sure that the balance of power remains in check, even when those in power might be tempted to overstep their bounds?
That's a really important question, and one that everyone should be thinking about.
I agree. And I think this video, while definitely coming from a specific perspective, does a good job of highlighting some of the challenges we face in trying to answer that question.
It definitely gives us a lot to consider.
It does. So thanks for joining me on this deep dive. I hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit unsettling.
It was definitely thought-provoking.
That's what we aim for. Until next time, keep those brains working.
Always.